Cool. And I think we should be live. Again, we'll wait a couple minutes for people to roll in. And if people, I already see some people in the chat. If you're in the chat, say hello and maybe say where you're watching from or streaming from. And it's also always interesting to hear a little extra if you're working on a project with Flyte or anything else in the ML space. Put it in the chat as well. And we'll wait a minute before we get into the awesome presentations that we have for you today from LinkedIn and
Enceladus.
Yeah, I was like, oh wait, I don't know if I've ever said it out loud.
Yeah.
How do you say it again?
Enceladus.
Enceladus Bio. Thank you. I've read the word many times, and I was like, I never have to say it to anyone. So thank you. How are you all doing today? I'll take that as great.
Yeah, doing well.
We are doing great. Thanks for having us over.
Yeah, thank you all for coming in. I'll just do a couple quick housekeeping notes, and then we'll get here into the presentations. And I see someone's watching from Portland, Oregon. Welcome. Again, if you're just joining in, I'm seeing people join in. Say hello in the chat. It's always fun to see kind of who's watching, maybe where you're watching from, what you're building as well. So welcome to the Flyte community presentation. We'll wait a couple minutes. Again, I think when we're done with the housekeeping notes, we'll kind of just get directly into the presentations here. But welcome to the Flyte community presentation. The goal with this meeting is to share Flyte-related stories and knowledge. If you're unfamiliar with Flyte, spelled F-L-Y-T-E, and links are in the description below as well. If you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, you can check out the GitHub and the Slack community. But if you're unfamiliar with it, it's one of the probably most popular open source orchestration platforms, often used in machine learning and AI applications, but that's not only where it's used. And then Union is powered by Flyte, and we're kind of one of its core maintainers. And you can check it out. Again, links to GitHub are in the description. I'll also share it in the chat here. Check it out if you haven't already. And then also, if you have an interesting story that you want to share, like if you're building something on a Flyte as well and you want to come up and do a presentation similar to what you're going to see today, ping us on the Slack community. Also, it's a great community if you just want to say hello in there as well and introduce yourself. We also have more upcoming events. If you love live events, I know I do. We have a fireside chat next week on AI observability. We have a book club in a couple weeks. Right now, we're reading Transformers for NLP and computer vision. And then we have a workshop later this month, actually 2 of them. One is Intro to AI Pipelines, and another one is Building Scalable Workflows for LLMs. So if you kind of want an introduction to Flyte, maybe it sounds really cool if you've never used it before, those workshops are going to be a great place to kind of get that introduction. Again, I'll share a link in the description. You can find all that in Slack, but you can also find it on union.ai/events. You can see all the upcoming stuff there. So with that, we have 2 presentations for you today. And we're going to get started with the first one. Ankit, are you ready to present?
Yep.
Awesome. I'll add your presentation to the stage, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ankit. I have Shardul with me. I am a tech lead for ML pipelines at LinkedIn. We're going to talk about Flyte at LinkedIn, how we use Flyte for our ML pipelines. I'll share a brief intro to what ML pipelines look at LinkedIn, and then Shardul will share the Flyte infrastructure and what it took for us to productionize it. So brief intro on what ML pipelines at LinkedIn look like. So we have this internal framework called PCV2. It's our older generation of model training and publishing platform. Basically, a PCV2 pipeline is made up of sequence of components. So these are logical steps that are written by subject matter experts. The framework provides a way to tie all of them together. So, for example, we have steps for feature preparation, data manipulation, training, model analyzing, model publishing, and then these steps have various implementations from different teams. Like we have our internal team which implemented the feature importer, and then like ads team, for example, they implemented their own. So and users pipelines are mainly config driven, so they provide configs to these components, like which data set to use, what parameters to use, and the pipeline sort of then the framework creates the DAG out of it and executes it. Now we had some challenges, especially with the experimentation velocity or like developer productivity. So to give you an idea, let's say a user, they have like a new model that they want to train, they have some new idea they want to try out. So originally they would, start locally, and then once they have written the actual code, they would build it. And the build ranged anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes to like 30 minutes because, we were pulling in all the dependencies. Some of these components are, Spark jobs. So they're pulling in all the Spark Scala dependencies, like all the Python training dependencies. They're packaging it, and then they're uploading it to Azkaban. So Azkaban is our in-house open sourced orchestrator. And the zip size could be in gigabytes, and users would upload it, and it can also vary depending on your speed of internet. And then they would execute the workflow, and workflow would run fine, and maybe it will fail after 2 hours for some reason. It could be an infra error, it could be user error, and there are a lot of reasons why a job could fail. And people would sort of repeat the whole process for every small change. So it wasn't very productive, and people were coming out with all kind of workarounds to be more productive. So that's when like we started looking at alternatives on how can we make our platform better. And so just to like reiterate challenges. So I think ML development is generally a very iterative process, and we had a very expensive feedback loop. Every mistake cost you a lot. And then people were doing a lot of repetitive work. Let's say the training failed, they were re-executing the data preparation steps, and it was a long time to fail. We had like average of 7 to 8 hours that it took, like one average for a pipeline to fail. And then like we had a lot of components, and each of those components had its own dependencies, but users would resolve all the dependencies in their local repo, which meant like we had like a very bad case of like dependency conflicts. People would like all the components had to be on the same Spark version. They had to work with exact same library, which was kind of a nightmare to manage when we had like more than 40 to 50 components that were provided by our team. And then the DSL was not very intuitive. It was very hard to create a new component. It was hard for users, and it took them like long time, more than a month, to just write a simple extension to the framework. And the reproducibility could be a challenge because Azkaban didn't store the artifacts. When you uploaded an artifact, Azkaban would get rid of the previous artifact. So it was really hard for us for people to reproduce their experiments. So how we use Flyte. So that's when we started looking into other solutions on like, okay, how can we improve our platform? And we came across Flyte, and we started evaluating Flyte. We worked a lot with Union AI team to productionize it. But so this is the final result of how we ended up changing our platform. Our new platform is called Open Connect. But yeah. So anyways, so for a component, for a training pipeline, users still have this components that they create their pipelines using. And now we have in Open Connect, what we have done is we have made all these components as reference workflows. So these components are still provided by subject matter experts, but they are not included in the user pipeline itself. They are published to Flyte as a reference workflow. I think I saw someone is asking what is FTS. FTS is a subset of Avro. It's a featureized data set. It allows us to it basically standardizes the schema that we use for our data sets. And we've also open sourced an FTS reader in TensorFlow IO, and it's magnitude faster than general Avro. Okay, so moving on. So we have so these components are still published. So what this helps us achieve is like users can upload and publish their components independently of what user pipelines are. And then user pipelines, they don't need to include the dependencies. Since these are reference workflows, they include their own dependencies when they're registered. So now we don't need to build anymore. So all our training dependencies are moved to container images, which users can publish. And all the component dependencies are independently published. So this allows users to just quickly iterate over the pipeline, right? So now any change, we can upload it within seconds or minutes, depending on how big their pipeline is. But we have greatly reduced the amount of time it takes to run your pipeline. So remote components themselves, for example, FTS importer here can be a DAG in themselves. So for example, we have Spark jobs. They normally, like, each component has multiple Spark jobs, or like there could be other job types. And these job types are then executed using our custom backend plugins, because we are still on Yarn for our Spark jobs. Shardul will talk a lot more about, or a little bit about, the design of this component, or like how we execute our jobs on Spark. For all the jobs, or like all the components, we have caching enabled by default. And we have also made some changes to the CLI. So we maintain our own CLI that can do the version management for us. Even version management for components, all the components are semantically versioned, and users don't have to worry about specifying the version. So our CLI takes care of adding the versions for them. Yeah, and as I mentioned, dependencies are self-contained. We also have a component registry for our users to find various flight launch plans that are published. A lot of these are published by our team, and then some of them are also published by other teams who are, some of them are researching. When they have a new, let's say, algorithm out, they can publish a component for rest of the teams to use. Yeah, just to summarize my part, so for us, like, how we use Flyte to address these challenges. So for the iteration process, we heavily use fast registration. We have also optimized the process of registration. Shardul will talk a little bit more about that, how we optimize registration process using our custom CLI. We use parameterized workflows and like reference workflows heavily for the remote components. And as I said, we use output caching a lot. So this has reduced our average time to fail to about 2 hours. And yeah, all the dependency management is through reference workflows or reference launch plans. And yeah, for reproducibility, we use versions of workflow in Flyte, and also we have an in-house metadata management. So these two combined, we can easily reproduce any of the experiments in Flyte. And then, yeah, the DSL, I think users seem to like the DSL. It's easier to extend. And we've also removed a lot of limitations. Now it's very straightforward to add your own components. They're basically Flyte launch plans. So technically any workflow can be a remote component. And then we have also invested a lot in user experience. We worked with open source to open source the Flyte. I think it's called Flyte Interactive. I'm blanking out on the name, but this was something we developed in-house first, and then, like, with a lot of contribution from the community, it's an open source plugin now. And then we made a lot of changes internally. So we have a record template transformer which supports our custom data types, so users don't have to rewrite their older pipelines to be able to run on Flyte. So all our existing data types from the previous framework, they are first class types in Flyte. So you can pass them around through various different tasks. Yeah, so just like, I guess this is the current workflow. Users author a pipeline. It takes less than a minute for them to upload, and with caching enabled, the path to failure is much shorter. If the user has run this pipeline before, they will skip those steps and will directly go to the failed step. So I will pass this on to Shardul now to talk more about how we productionized Flyte at LinkedIn.
Thanks, Ankit. I'll share my screen. Hi everyone, I'm Shardul. I'm one of the leads in the data infrastructure org within LinkedIn. And as Ankit talked about, Flyte did provide us numerous advantages in helping optimize our machine learning pipelines and overall machine learning workflow. However, taking it to full productionization within an organization like LinkedIn, where we already have a well-established data stack, where some legacy orchestrators such as Azkaban were already in picture. It did require a good bit of effort. So the slide provides like a fairly high-level view of how Flyte is currently deployed. So we will be diving into some specific sections within this diagram further along in the presentation, and essentially talking about several customizations or changes that we had to make to take it to deployment and full productionization within LinkedIn. So on the left, you can see it's the Flyte clients. We have a variety of clients. Uh, so this might not be that uncommon of occurrence in multiple organizations, but at least in our case, there is a clear demarcation between platform teams and development teams, which are responsible for maintaining systems which other users can use. The platform team, for example, what Ankit's team manages as a set of training components along with the overall user experience. And users in turn can build their workflows using the components which are PCB2 slash OpenConnect, which are directly provided as reference launch plans and can be directly integrated within the user pipeline DAGs. A couple of other platform related notes. So we are deploying everything on Kubernetes. So that's one of the reasons why Flyte was very attractive to us. It's fully Kubernetes native and worked quite seamlessly with the fairly minimal changes required on our end to operationalize it within the Kubernetes stack at LinkedIn. One more important note that we have a fairly large deployment of Yarn, and all of our Spark tasks currently execute on Yarn. So Spark is also heavily used for both just general data pipelines as well as for specific machine learning related components. So for that reason, it was quite important for us to have Flyte operate with Yarn. And the way we ended up doing that was through use of an intermediary service, which is labeled here in green, called Grid Gateway. And we'll be talking a bit more about how the plugin for that service itself is implemented within Flyte. So let's start talking about the one of the clients, which is the core CLI, which is used by multiple folks within LinkedIn. And this is something our team developed. And the key distinction for this CLI compared to the open source clients which are already provided is one, it integrates well within the LinkedIn subsystems and also provides a number of optimizations. So one of the key optimizations is essentially the ordering in which the workflows get serialized. So with the default clients, we observed a behavior where the packaging and uploading to Flyte would happen first, and after that, the workflows would be serialized. However, in our experience, serialization of the workflows is most likely the step which will run into some user visible problems. For example, they might not have set up data types correctly, so inputs and outputs may not be matching for tasks. So these kind of issues are all resolved during serialization. But if we follow the pattern that we can see in this workflow at the top, it would essentially require uploads to our internal blob store. And only after that, users will be able to find out that something actually failed as part of their workflow serialization. So MLDev CLI pulls in the process for serialization. So logically, it makes it one of the first steps that happens. So like essentially any problems are identified much sooner, which would have taken longer to identify if we followed the vanilla serialization process. So that provides a significant advantage. Users are able to find failures faster. In addition, MLDev CLI plus a number of client-side integrations that we perform also uh, improve the production readiness of individual pipelines, both for teams which are building core components which get registered as reference launch plans, as well as for individual machine learning teams and users who are trying to create their own workflows using those components and committing it to different repositories. So a good chunk of work went into integrating this entire process with our internal build and release framework. So the key idea being that individual teams can commit to their own repositories, and we the build system is able to both essentially compile as well as register the workflows following semantic versioning for each of the workflows. So this is again something where the versioning of entities which Flyte provides by default comes in very handy. So for everything which is registered as part of a proper build pipeline within LinkedIn, all of those flows get semantically versioned, and it's possible and very straightforward for users to actually move dependencies, try a newer version of a component, or try to roll back to a previous version of a component. In addition, there is also a GitHub Actions integration, which allows execution of workflows and other tests on Flyte automatically on PR merges. So moving on. Yeah, we talked about client-side integrations a bit. Just diving a bit deeper into what changes we had to make within the Flyte core stack to essentially operationalize it within LinkedIn. So some of the key changes are listed out here. This is not an exhaustive list, but at least the key ones are pointed out here. One is we at LinkedIn we don't use S3. We have an internal object store called Ambry, which is well supported and widely used within LinkedIn. So one of the key changes we had to make within the control plane side of things was to essentially provide an implementation for Ambry. So this, fortunately, the way Flyte code is architected, most of such changes can be neatly implemented behind interfaces. So which makes both implementation as well as testing a lot easier than it would have been otherwise. So for example, in case of Ambry, it was more a matter of writing like a uh, uh, implementation which is parallel to the ISTO implementation that Flyte already uses for Golang. And similarly for the Python side of object store usage, it was essentially providing an alternative implementation through FSS which helped us get to this much faster than we would have been able to otherwise. Also, one critical change was use of MySQL instead of Postgres. So Flyte code had a very strong dependency on Postgres initially. However, MySQL is the only supported RDBMS, which is supported by like a separate team within MySQL. So it was imperative for us to adapt Flyte for MySQL. And the team at Union AI was very helpful. They helped refactor the database related components within Flyte such that a lot of the functionality was pulled into the stdlib, as well as provided an initial implementation of how MySQL could be operationalized within Flyte. So we have made a number of changes on top of that, and we are in the process of figuring out how best to contribute it back to open source as well. In addition, we also use the multi-cluster capability of Flyte quite significantly. So I'll be talking about this one in more detail in the next slide. And of course, we did have a number of security-related requirements, so internal authentication and authorization protocols that had to be used with Flyte. So again, it came across as a number of implementation changes, and for the most part, which we were able to put behind interfaces. So either through gRPC interceptors or with other mechanisms within Flyte. So talking about the multi-cluster setup a bit more. So at a high level, this explains what the layout we are using for multi-cluster. The key points of reference here are essentially that there is a single control plane instance which is able to submit tasks to more than one data plane instance, which is essentially the propeller. So two different Kubernetes clusters, and the tasks are submitted to different Kubernetes clusters. In our case, we also introduced some custom routing logic within Flyte Admin, which takes into account what kind of GPUs, instance types, and other resources might be available on each of the Kubernetes clusters, and can route the requests correctly to one or the other cluster. So this really helps us break the boundaries of an individual Kubernetes cluster, and that's also one of the reasons why Flyte was fairly attractive for us. We are already using it across a couple of different Kubernetes clusters, and in future we expect to use this more. And while we build more sophistication into some of the routing mechanisms between clusters. And talking about the plugins a bit, just a second. So, yeah, uh, the uh, the stack for implementing the tasks and other plugins within Flyte. That also presented some interesting opportunities for us. So for the most part, the Kubernetes-based plugins, which includes simple Python tasks, PyTorch, and other plugins, they could be used out of the box, again, with some changes required, but they were relatively few. However, we did have a need for accessing, especially the Spark-based infrastructure within LinkedIn, and with the Spark being fully based on Yarn. So we were already in the process of developing a service which can submit tasks to Yarn, among other among other compute engines. And that service operates in a sort of an orchestrator agnostic way. So it's essentially a task submission service, and where you can submit tasks for individual systems for which you have an operator defined. And in this case, we essentially use the Spark operator for that service to submit requests directly to Yarn. So we use it for Spark. Plus, we have a few varieties of others jobs which execute exclusively on Yarn currently, and this service helps us act as the intermediary for those interactions. And the Grid Gateway operator within Flyte itself is implemented as a web API backend plugin. We'll be touching upon this a bit more in one of the subsequent slides. And also, we'll talk about some of the other plugins and integrations that had to be performed in the execution path. So, Grid Gateway task, I already spoke about this a bit. One important thing to note is that the key data store for all the tasks is still HDFS, whether they execute on Kubernetes or they execute on Yarn. And in case of Yarn, the HDFS integration is fairly straightforward. They evolved as part of the same ecosystem, so that works pretty smoothly already out of the box. However, accessing HDFS from Kubernetes containers directly is typically not that straightforward. We have an internal mechanism which was open sourced a couple of years ago called Qto that essentially bridges the gap in the authentication between Kubernetes and HDFS, and provides us some means to acquire HDFS delegation tokens directly within Kubernetes. So this was quite instrumental in providing access to HDFS data from within Python tasks, PyTorch, and any other Kubernetes-based tasks. We are also developing data triggers. So data triggers is essentially a way of executing workflows based on arrival of data, as opposed to like running them periodically or based on a cron schedule, or for triggering them manually. So this is already a feature which is available, which was available in Escavan. and also something that our users will fundamentally rely on for a number of workloads which need to wait for availability of data, maybe on an hourly or a daily basis to execute some processing. We are leveraging Flyte agents for this, and it's essentially going to be implemented as a sensor which can wait for availability of individual datasets. In addition, there are a number of plugin implementations for different kinds of notifications that users want to receive for workflow executions. So I'll also be talking about this one a bit more in one of the subsequent slides. So yeah, this is a sample invocation of what the Spark task invocation looks internally when we are using the Grid Gateway plugin. And what it provides is, while this may not conform directly to what the Spark plugin within Flyte provides, it provides a easy interface for users who already have plugins, who already have Spark jobs developed using our Java plus using Java on our Yarn-based ecosystem to essentially retain a very similar interface where they are able to provide execution jars and able to invoke their Spark tasks directly. And a quick note about the uh, Grid Gateway plugin implementation within Flyte. It uses the async plugin interface. It's a very lightweight plugin where the entire processing is offloaded to the separate Grid Gateway service, and the Flyte plugin can simply interface with that service and just execute API calls, both for submission of the task as well as for tracking the status and surfacing any errors, etc., as and when they might happen. So also the notification system used for on calls is called Iris within LinkedIn. So I think this has also been open sourced a couple of years ago, and we provided an implementation for this as well, where users can essentially, as part of their launch plan creation, provide information about what kind of events they are interested in, and based on whether a workflow succeeded, failed, or whatever they have provided at the time of launch plan registration, they will get a notification through different supported mechanisms, with email and Slack already being supported, and Iris is something that we added. In addition, we also have emission to Kafka for workflow lifecycle events. So essentially, for every workflow execution, the detailed information about the execution of every step that is submitted as a Kafka event, and that is done is materialized into a data set on HDFS, where it can be used for like offline analytics. And yeah, this is the last slide essentially. We have closely collaborated with the Flyte open source community, and in the process also helped create multiple features as well as bug fixes within the wider community. We are always open to more engagements, and there is definitely more that we are working on with the Flyte community, and this is not an exhaustive list. So we look forward to working with more folks in the future, and thanks a lot for giving us this opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have for me or Ankit.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation and for all the Flyte contributions you mentioned. I know the community loves them. We love them. You mentioned Flyte Interactive. I posted the link to go check that out if people haven't yet. That's a fantastic plugin. Really awesome. And then just like they said, open for Q&A. There might be a couple questions in the chat that we didn't get to. I'm going to scroll up and find those. But if anyone watching has questions, put them in the chat, whether you're streaming this on LinkedIn or YouTube. put your questions in the chat and we can get to them. I think one of the questions was you mentioned a Spark a lot, and the person who had this question said it's great. And they were wondering if you had thoughts about moving to Ray or if you had looked at that as part of your infrastructure.
Yeah, so we do support Ray internally, but LinkedIn just have way too much infrastructure related to Spark. It's very mature platform. So for most of the large data processing jobs, we exclusively use Spark. Yeah, I mean, Ray is supported for tuning and some bulk inference use cases, but not for, we don't use it for data processing that heavily.
And just to add to that, we have a dedicated Spark team within LinkedIn as well. And the internal deployment of a Spark is heavily tuned and optimized. So yeah, it's as Ankit said, it's heavily used, and at least in the near future, it will continue to be the case.
I think this was partially answered during the presentation, but the person also asked about FDS, the feature of I think it was Opero, and they were wondering if you could elaborate on it a little bit more.
Yeah, so featureized dataset is, like I said, it's a subset of Avro data types. So normally Avro serialization and deserialization is very heavy. So we have narrowed down the types that we support. It's open sourced. I can share the link. Unfortunately, I'm not able to join the chat, but it's in TensorFlow IO code. In the TensorFlow IO repo, there is a plugin that we contributed, and it has a, I think, presentation link to it as well, and it explains the performance differences and the schema and the differences. And it also fuses things like batching, shuffling in the op itself, so it provides like a large performance boost for that.
Awesome. Was there any other ones I missed, David?
I think there's one on Ambry on Dynamo. So we don't, we are on RAM, so we don't use, I assume this is referring to AWS Dynamo. So we don't use Dynamo internally. It's an in-house database. Yeah, I think eSpark task is not written in an agent. It's before agents were a thing. So we just wrote it in the Flyte backend as Flyte backend plugin. Yeah, install server 2 is routing. How are two control planes different? So the control planes are basically two different clusters with two different GPU SKUs. So yeah, so the differences in terms of hardware they have, and we are also moving to multi-region. So yeah, I guess there are multiple reasons for multi-cluster. One is like fault tolerance, and the other is just like internal reasons that we have new clusters coming in and some clusters being deprecated. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a couple of additional questions, and I think that's it. This is the first
one of them.
one.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have a couple more, I think, too.
Okay.
One of them is what is the scale of the GPU cluster that you're running in Flyte?
I don't know how much we can share. I don't know but yeah, it's in terms of nodes, I would say we have 2,000 to 3,000 nodes that includes in one cluster that includes like CPUs and GPUs.
Cool. And someone was asking, presentation was awesome. Showed how you incorporated Flyte into your pipeline. What was like maybe the top values you got out of changing over to Flyte from your previous infrastructure?
Yeah, I think one thing is it's Kubernetes native. So we already have had our platform, like all the operators are basically, we were already using Kubernetes operator even with Azkaban. But with Flyte, like it came closer to that, so we could easily develop new plugins without wiring in a lot of things from us. And I think the main value is the fast iteration speed that we were able to provide to users, and the dependency management. Dependency management is still not easy, I would say, but it's like much better than what we had in Azkaban, where we had to like get everything together, upload it, which was a huge pain. Yeah.
And to add to that, I guess the richness of the Flyte Python SDK, that might be a bit underappreciated. So even comparing with other orchestrators or systems, generally nothing else has that detailed of implementation on the client side, which is very straightforward to use and also provides a lot of functionality in terms of ensuring type safety. So type safety and other mechanisms due to which it's like harder to kind of make errors, and it's easier to use and actually integrate with Flyte through an API as well as through the SDK for writing workflows.
Did you have any friction of I don't know, onboarding people to the type safety? I know it's something that comes up a lot when we talk to people, and then once people start using typing in Python functions, they usually don't even go back when they write stuff outside of Flyte. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I think there were definitely challenges, and I think some of them we open sourced as well. So things like, first of all, understanding the concept of promise can be confusing for users because Azkaban didn't have any such concept. And then, there were, I would say, maybe gaps or missed features where, you couldn't reference promises as inputs. So some of them we contributed outside. There are some features we maintain internally, like config overrides. I would say their design is not the best, but it works for us. So that's why like we discussed a lot in open source, and we also had a design, but it was still not complete. So we have some basic implementation for the small feature set that we need internally. So, but yeah, I think overall the type system helped us at least ease the migration because we were able to implement our custom types in Flyte ecosystem, because otherwise it would have been very tricky for us to like move everyone, like all our components, to the new type system. So type system is certainly one of the things that's harder to understand a little bit, but it works well once you kind of understand it.
Awesome. And two other questions came in that I think are kind of actually very related together. Is I'll just read one of them, but the other one's kind of asking the same thing. Is can you briefly go over how dependencies are handled differently with Flyte again?
Yeah, so we use Gradle, for example, for our dependency management. So normally, when users used to depend on components, let's say they depended on 10 components, they would put all those 10 components in their Gradle, and they would build the project as a whole. So we will pull all the dependencies for all the components into user multi-product, and then they would get like a zip out of it. With Flyte, all the individual components, now they are in their own repo, and they do their own dependency sort of build, and then they upload it to Flyte as a workflow, and we expose to users as a reference launch plan. So users only need to know the data types to trigger the reference launch plan. They don't really need the Spark dependencies because those are already published with the component itself. So that sort of simplifies the whole zip that we create in the user workflow. And then all our TensorFlow dependencies, they are already in container images. So we have a proper CI/CD pipeline which users can use to publish builds. So those also, like, they don't need to ship with the workflow itself. So in the Flyte registration, we only ship user code, like the Flyte workflow code, and they have like they can provide custom resources. If like they have some configs, they can also ship those with the Flyte workflow itself.
Just to provide a comparison, in case of Azkaban, where everything gets shipped as part of the workflow definition itself, the typically your zips would include dependencies which are like all these Spark dependencies if your workflow contains a Spark code, and just the sheer number of jars included could easily push the uploaded file sizes, the zip file size uh, to gigabytes. So even pushing that amount of data plus the fact that majority of can be extracted and can be packaged separately as Docker images, that that provides a significant boost, both in terms of like overall architecture of how the system behaves, as well as user experience in terms of being able to upload and iterate over things much faster than before.
Awesome. And I think maybe one other question, to the extent that you are able to share, how many users across your data science and ML and software engineering team are using Flyte?
I think we have like a couple of hundred users now using Flyte on a daily basis.
That's awesome. And if anyone else has any other questions in the future, or you're watching this recording, go join the Slack in the description, or go to slack.flyte.org. If you have any questions about Flyte, you can ask them there as well. So thank you so much, Ankit and Shardul, for coming up and giving this presentation. It was fantastic. I don't know if you have anything else you want to shout out or say before we move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. And I think it's been a great journey for us, like working with Union, like Ketan and the whole team wouldn't have been possible without them. For us, it was a large venture. Like there were a lot of unknowns in the beginning. So Union folks were really helpful in like resolving all the issues, like answering all our basic questions when we started. Like we had little idea on how, Flyte worked. And also like community is very open to, I think, changes. So a lot of times when we hit blockers, we were able to contribute back. Like there were a lot of changes we made to Kubeflow plugins because we use those heavily internally. And the community was mostly never like why. It's like, okay, how can we fix this problem? So I think that was really helpful in us, like, kicking the ground. So really, thanks to the whole Flyte community and Union AI.
Yeah. Again, thank you to all your fantastic contributions too from LinkedIn. They're amazing.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to bring up the next presenter, Rio. And thank you again, Ankit and Shardul. Welcome up, Rio. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm going to bring up your presentation here, slides, and take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So switching to a completely different topic, but still in the Flyte space, I'll be talking about gene editing R&D with Flyte at Enceladus Bio. So Enceladus Bio is a gene editing startup, and we're developing gene editing therapeutics. Now, I know this is quite a broad background of viewers today. So what does gene editing therapeutics mean? Well, we're essentially trying to cure diseases by developing ways to edit patients' genomes. And so editing genomes can mean a lot of different things. For us, it means we can insert new DNA into genomes. We can exchange someone's genomes with a different code, or just remove parts of the genome. Again, we're trying to do all of this in order to cure diseases, and there's a lot of diseases that can be treated this way. Now, the biology behind gene editing therapeutics is quite deep and quite broad, and I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details there, but I will talk more about the computation piece today. In particular, how does Flyte really enable the development of gene editing therapeutics? So today, I want to focus on three different pieces. First is, how does Enceladus Bio use computation? Then I'll dive into Flyte and why we chose Flyte. And then what have we learned from using Flyte? We're very much an early user of Flyte. We're still learning how it works and all the systems, but we've already learned quite a bit, and it has been helpful for us. So starting with, well, how do we use computation? The main goal of this presentation for us is we want to share what we do and who we are. And that's just because the Flyte community is great, and I think we want to derive more development towards our use cases. So I wanted to tell you more about how we use computation and how we use Flyte. So again, gene editing therapeutics is a large biological space which covers a variety of areas, from the tiny little molecules to all the way to organismal studies. It can also cover DNA, RNA, and protein biology. And so there's just a lot of biology to cover. So among all the research areas at Enceladus Bio, the computation team supports all of them. And we have a relatively small computation team, and the computation team is composed of computational biologists and bioinformaticians, mainly trained in academia. The specialties of our team is biological data analysis, machine learning, sequencing, assay development. And I mentioned this because we don't have what these big, large software companies have, which are dedicated data engineers or dedicated software engineers. And so as a computation team, it is a challenge for us to really support these variety of research areas. Now, how do we lend support? And to describe this, I want to go through a typical R&D experiment. And you can think about the goal of a typical R&D experiment in gene editing as we just want to develop a new drug for gene editing. And you could oversimplify and split into 3 different steps. First is we just design a gene editing therapeutic. Second, we take that therapeutic and apply it to cells. And lastly, we want to see how well it worked. And that's basically just taking the cells, analyzing the cells for gene editing outcomes, usually consisting of sequencing those cells. Now, all of this can be done rather manually. Some parts would definitely require computation, but we do incorporate computation and data flow across the whole process just to empower the scientists in terms of design and analysis. And one way to show that is by splitting each of these sections up and demonstrating the data flow. So data flow is kind of what the input of the data is, where we process that data, and then finally the output. The input can range from a variety of different sources. It can range from published data sets to results from our own experiments to just scientists generating data or instruments generating data. And then finally, the output, usually most of the outputs get funneled into an electronic lab notebook, or ELN, or a lab information management system, or LIMS. In addition, we use S3 and database as our data lake. Now, I want to dive a little bit more deeply into each of these processes. So we could first dive into the design process. So again, the problem is how do we design a novel gene editor? So I want to give you an example workflow. Let's say a person comes up with this goal. Okay, I want to find a novel gene editing candidate. One hypothesis is, we could look into bacterial data sets. You may have heard of CRISPR-Cas systems, and CRISPR is a bacterial system. So we may be able to identify other gene editing candidates by looking through bacterial data sets. There's a lot of bacterial data sets out there. One big one is called GenBank, where a lot of bacterial genomes are dumped. And it takes a lot of computation power to just go through all of these genomes and try to find, this might be a nice candidate, or this other region might be a better candidate. Not only do we have to go through these metagenomic data sets and search them, we also need to characterize them. And we need to see, okay, well, does this look like a gene editor or does it not? And one way to characterize them is by folding them or seeing what the structure is. So we're essentially taking a sequence of A, T, C's, and G's, and then folding them up into either proteins or RNA. Again, that requires computation. And finally, at the end of the design process, we want to actually create a therapeutic from them. And we often do this at large scale. So in order to do the design process, which can be done manually, we often automate. And by automating, we can incorporate automated QC checks. We can put these pieces together like Lego pieces, and then throw them into our LIMS. Once they're into our LIMS, we can then, or this is the lab information management system, we can send them to get synthesized by a vendor. So that's the design workflow. Computation and data can also be used in terms of figuring out, well, does a gene editor work or not? And that's what I call the application and the analysis stage. Just to give you a little bit more detail of what that looks like. Again, the problem is we want to see how well our gene editors work in the cells. Are we editing 5% of the cells? Are we editing 10% of the cells? Are we editing these cells perfectly, or are there off-target effects? And so there's a variety of readouts that enable us to measure that. And we have a bunch of instruments in the lab, and these instruments are constantly pumping out data. And they can range from next generation sequencing, which are basically just short reads of DNA sequence, to Sanger sequencing, which is another way to look at DNA sequences. Long read sequences, which are even longer versions of your standard or canonical next generation sequences. These are, again, measuring DNA, but with a completely different machine and different technology. And flow cytometry, where flow cytometry gives you cellular level information. And finally, these are only just a subset of the readouts that we get. There's a wide variety of other QC measurements and instruments that we use. Each of these often require computation expertise to analyze them. So with that, I want to wrap up this section of how Enceladus Bio uses computation. And I wanted to just leave you with a few pieces of themes. One theme is that we have a large number of pipelines, a large number of analyses that we have to do, and each one has very different technology to work with, and oftentimes a very different software tool set as well. Another is that computation can be used throughout the whole R&D process, and it can be actually sporadic at times. It's often not a steady stream of data that's being generated, but data is generated at bursts. So how does this theme of computation, how we apply computation to gene editing R&D, why does this require Flyte? So going back to the data flow diagram, you can see that there's a lot of different data flowing back and forth from one source to another. And in order to support all of these, we had to create a large number of pipelines. And here's just the different AWS services we use for our pipelines. So we sometimes have our manual EC2 instances. We often use Lambda functions and also spin up jobs through AWS Batch. And highlighting on the right, the data flow, the different services that are incorporated in each of these pieces of the process. And you can see that there's already a lot of Batch and Lambda being used. And this is just the subset of pipelines. We have a large number that we have to support. Because of these large numbers, it required an orchestrator to manage them. And there's a lot of orchestrators out there, but Flyte met our requirements. And particularly what was attractive about Flyte was just how easy it is to develop with it. On the left-hand side is just the sample code that's on the Flyte docs, but this was really what attracted us initially, which is simply just adding decorators. We can really create a workflow. And this is just one task decorator and one workflow decorator. And we just love how simple it is and how easy it is to move from our current way of writing code and into the Flyte way of writing code. And one big requirement that this actually solved was the separation concerns between data science and infrastructure. Back when we had to support all of these batch and Lambda pipelines, the data scientists also had to get that infrastructure set up. So had to write the batch job definition, the computer environments, and specify that, or figure out how to trigger the batch job through a Lambda function. And that just added to a lot of the infrastructure work that we didn't really want the data scientists to be focusing on. And that separation concerns that Flyte enables was particularly attractive as well. So to touch a little bit more in detail about a particular use case for Flyte, here's one where we have a scientist-triggered sequencing analysis. This goes into steps 2 and 3 of the gene editing R&D workflow that I mentioned before. But sometimes we end up with a bunch of sequencing data, and we want to analyze the gene editing outcomes. Again, how well did this gene editor edit the genome? How precise was it? And this analysis is powered by Flyte. So one way we analyze this workflow is through a trigger by the scientist. So a scientist will look at the instrument and see, okay, the data is coming out, and then wants to trigger an analysis and convert those ACs, Ts, and Gs to actually gene editing rates. We have a retool dashboard that enables this. And so the scientist is able to click and choose various parameters or the specific run that they want, and then start the analysis. The analysis will kick off a Flyte workflow. And one thing that was really nice about Flyte is that its API was really easy to use and easily integrated into our existing systems. So we just had to do a quick change in our retool code to trigger a Flyte job as opposed to a batch job. And in the actual Flyte workflow, we gathered the data from S3 and run our pipelines on this. In this example, we are running a nanopore pipeline, which is a long read DNA sequencer. And that analyzes the data. Again, Flyte really shine in this example where we sometimes have very small jobs and we sometimes have very large jobs. And in terms of our large jobs, our DAGs can run kind of out of the screen. We have hundreds of samples that we have to analyze at the same time in parallel. And so Flyte really was able to scale quite easily between these small and large jobs, and also was quite compatible with our containers. And finally, once the Flyte workflow is done, it gets funneled to a notification system where we want to notify the scientist that the analysis is complete. And so with that, we use the Cloud Events integration with Flyte that is hooked up to Amazon SNS. And then that gets sent to Slack. Again, we really liked how visible the workflow status is in Flyte, and that just enabled us to hook things up very seamlessly and quickly. And with that, the scientists will then get a notification on Slack that their run is complete and is able to download their gene editing outcome analyses. And finally, at the end, I want to touch on, well, what have we learned from using Flyte? We haven't been using Flyte for that long, but I think we've learned a lot from it already. One thing is this Kubernetes first mindset. Again, our computation team is mostly consists of people trained in academia. And so there's a shift in mindset when we go from the academic computational biology mindset to the industry cloud mindset. In particular, in academia, we're really used to these large co-location data centers that are part of the academic institution with job submission systems and module systems. And when we move to industry, we need to shift our mindset to this cloud-based approach. And the first things that are often picked up by people with our background are, well, AWS Batch, which really mimics that job submission system that we're used to, or Lambda functions. And again, we also pick up containers as a tool that we use so that we can try or work across different environments. But with that, as I mentioned before, we can get a large set of batch jobs and a large set of Lambda jobs that we need to start thinking about and coordinating. And that then, I think with this Flyte shift, we're starting to think a little bit more from a Kubernetes first perspective, where we, as data scientists, don't really think about batch, or we don't really think about Lambda as much. And we just think about the orchestrator. And that simplifies the work that's needed by the team, because we just need to, the orchestrator, Flyte here, is just written in Python, so it's in a language that we're very comfortable with, and still keeping the containers that we're already used to. And a separate group can handle the auto-scaling cluster management. Additionally, a few things that we learned was we picked up Flyte for this use case. Here's a list on the right. So Flyte the hard way, this is the GitHub repo that goes through the tutorial for setting up Flyte and EKS. And it was just a fantastic resource for getting us started. So thank you for everyone who's contributed to that. We used Carpenter for handling our auto-scaling, and that worked particularly well. For logging, we additionally added, just used AWS Container Insights. So we just clicked the button in our EKS configuration that turned up the Amazon CloudWatch observability, and that enabled logging for us and was very easy to do. The Flyte API has been fantastic, as I mentioned already. We've used it with the Swagger editor, and that has been really nice to navigate. And then we also learned that the directory structuring is particularly important in Flyte in terms of managing the packaging and registration of workflows, and we're still trying to learn more about how to do that effectively. I do want to acknowledge both the Enceladus Bio computation team, so Kelsey and Will on our team, who have been actively helping us navigate this transition to using Flyte, and also the Flyte team, who have been very helpful and instrumental in both introducing us to Flyte and its capabilities, and also getting us set up and getting our cluster up and running. So thank you so much to David, John, and Keaton, and the whole Flyte Slack community. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and we'll open up to any questions that you may have.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It was a really great presentation. And just like you said, open to questions. I think there's a couple in the chat that I can go pull up. But while I'm doing that, if anyone else wants to ask any questions, put them in the chat, whether you're watching on LinkedIn or YouTube. We'll see them come through on our feed over here. So again, thank you for the presentation, too. It was really, really cool. I love the section of what you learned, what you learned of about using Flyte. I think that's really helpful, kind of talking about like the differences of how you have to think about something when you're doing the Kubernetes first infrastructure. And I really like the call out too of how easy it was for you to take how you already write code and turn it into a Flyte workflow, because it's a Python function with a different decorator.
Yeah, thank you. It's been rather seamless transition. I think the hardest part for us was really getting comfortable with Kubernetes and setting that up. Obviously, with Union, and there's alternative approaches to just setting it up ourselves, but we wanted to give that challenge a try, and it worked well for us.
Absolutely. And like you'd mentioned, shout out to the Slack support as well and all those other names. But it's really so cool to see so many people that aren't from the Flyte contributor or the Union side. How many people answer questions in the Slack channels? Anytime someone has any type of question about implementing something in Flyte, there's always someone that comes in with the answer, which I think is really cool. I know you mentioned a couple of values and features you loved, but maybe I'd like to reiterate on them again from a question of like, what is the biggest, I'm going to reword it, but like, what is the biggest value or values, or maybe some of the favorite features that you really liked about Flyte that come to top of mind?
Yeah, well, I think it's really that easy way to transition into Flyte. So just adding the decorators and writing the functions, it's so simple. We can actually develop these Flyte workflows in our Jupyter notebooks. And that's also really nice, and just prevents us from having to kind of go out of our notebooks and then back into our notebooks. And that makes the process of development really easy. And that is incredibly important for a startup like us, where we're rather limited in the number of people and we have on our team and the projects that we can pick up.
Awesome. And also kind of inspired from one of the questions from the last presentations, how many people, if you can share, like how many people are currently using Flyte in your organization?
Yeah, so we have our computation team is a team of 3. And so all 3 of us are developing with Flyte. Now, in terms of the actual users, our entire company is leveraging it for running the pipelines. So they're not actually interacting directly with Flyte itself, but will be triggering jobs that will run Flyte workflows. Awesome.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's amazing. And how many? you might have had some of it in the presentation. Again, where you're willing to share is like, what does your maybe GPU cluster look like that you're managing with Flyte right now? And
Yeah.
I'm sure it might vary right now depending on what you're working on as well.
Yeah, so right now we actually don't have use GPUs on Flyte at all. And that's something that we're actively thinking about building up, because we do use various language models for some of our design. But right now it's basically just regular compute instances.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. And then there's a question from the chat about kind of your pipeline. Are you using anything for model management, maybe separate from, I guess, Flyte artifacts?
Yeah, so we were using MLflow for a while for model management and registry. But right now we're kind of in this transition point of trying to figure out what is the best next registry to work with. So at this point, nothing, or just putting everything into our Git repo.
Awesome. Yeah, and if it works, that's great. Yeah, any other questions? If anyone has any, put them in the chat. I'm sorry, did I miss one, David?
No, I mean, I just wanted to add that. Yeah, thank you, Rio. I don't think I've seen a more concrete and accurate summary of the Flyte value proposition in a while. I mean, the presentation show a structured approach to learning, and for a challenge that is very hard. I mean, academically trained researchers and Kubernetes infrastructure is kind of two different worlds. And yeah, I think you've been navigating a lot of challenges very well. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you for all your help. It's been yeah, that has been instrumental in getting us started, and we really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Cool. If there aren't any other questions, again, you can always join, or right now, again, if people are probably going to be watching this recording too. So if you want to go ask questions later, join the Slack channel. I think everyone who's been speaking today has brought up how helpful the Slack community is as well. It's very active. And if you have questions, it's a great place to put them. And like I mentioned, somebody answers them. It's awesome. Someone did ask one other question. Maybe I think we might have time for one more. Is if you could briefly describe a little bit more about your ML job checking for protein receptors.
So as you may know, there's more than just large language models that are trained off of the web corpus. There's also language models that are trained on protein sequences, or language models trained on DNA sequences. And so we leverage those language models and are using them to see how they inform our gene editors. We can use them either as a foundation model, or we could even use them as zero-shot learning.
Very cool. Before we wrap up the stream, is there anything else you want to shout out? Any links you want to, share for anyone to go check out what you're working on, or any upcoming things you want to shout out?
Yeah, I guess my main two goals is really I want to encourage more of the Flyte community to develop towards the use case for biotech startups like us. I think there's where each of us individually are a small company, but there's a lot of biotech companies, and I think Flyte is perfect for it. I think the second is just that I want to encourage biotech startups to start using orchestrators like Flyte, and I think by just increasing the community, we can develop more for the biotech use case. I think you're on mute, Sage.
Whoops, I swear I clicked the button, but thank you again so much for coming on and sharing. This is a fantastic presentation. And if anyone wants to start developing on Flyte, again, join the Slack channel, go to flyte.org, check out the GitHub. It's, pretty easy to run your first workflow. Hopefully it won't be your worst workflow, but I guess it could be if it's the first one as well. But yeah, and then ask questions in the Slack, and there's a lot of documentation, a lot of examples. Check out everything we're doing at flyte.org, and then also at union.ai. And we just launched a serverless version of Union that makes it really easy to try out Flyte as well. If you don't want to set up everything yourself locally right now, you could go in and sign up for serverless. It's free, no card required or anything, and then basically write your first Flyte workflow in there as well. Awesome. With that, if there's no other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and probably end the live stream here, unless there's anything else anyone has to say, but I think we're good. All right, I'm going to hit end. Thank you again, everyone who came and asked questions and watched, and then especially thank you to all the speakers today. This is a really fantastic, both presentations were really fantastic. So hopefully people really enjoyed them. It seemed like people did. People kept saying fantastic presentation for each one. Someone just said, you rocked. This is awesome. So I'm going to end the stream again. If people want to continue talking, go join the Slack channel, introduce yourself there. And hopefully I'll talk to some of you all later. I'm going to hit the end.